When a prime minister walks into a cabinet meeting knowing that the chair recently occupied by his health secretary is now empty because that same man resigned and publicly called for his resignation, the silence in that room carries a political weight that no press statement can neutralize. That is the reality Keir Starmer faces this week, not as a moment of personal embarrassment, but as a defining test of whether a government under sustained internal pressure can still project the kind of structural authority that governing a nation demands. Subscribe for more analysis. Here we don't sugarcoat, we expose what others are afraid to say. The resignation of Wes Streeting from the health secretary position is not simply a personnel story. Streeting was not a backbench figure. He was one of the most prominent, most publicly visible members of the cabinet, a politician who had built considerable independent credibility on the NHS debate, and who represented a particular strand of reformist labor thinking that many in Westminster had considered central to the government's domestic agenda. When a figure of that weight walks out and simultaneously calls on the Prime Minister to leave, it is not a tremor, it is a signal, and signals in politics have consequences that extend well beyond the immediate news cycle. But here is what the coverage tends to flatten. Starmer does not flinch. He assembles the new cabinet, he chairs the meeting, he states clearly and without theatrical elaboration that he will not walk away from Downing Street. And in that refusal, understated, deliberate, almost administrative in its delivery, there is a form of political endurance that his critics consistently underestimate. The chaos around him is real, but so is his capacity to absorb it without visibly fracturing, and that capacity, unglamorous as it appears, is not nothing in a political environment that has consumed prime ministers with frightening regularity. The Andy Burnham dimension transforms this story from a cabinet reshuffle narrative into something considerably larger. The Greater Manchester Mayor's decision to contest the Makerfield by-election is not a quiet political maneuver. It is a deliberate and calculated re-entry into parliamentary politics, and everyone watching British politics understands what it means. Burnham carries a particular kind of political equity that is rare in the current landscape: genuine cross-regional appeal, a reputation built outside Westminster, and a public persona that reads as authentic rather than manufactured, qualities that polling data now translates into something Starmer cannot ignore.
The YouGov numbers are stark. 59% of Labour members would back Burnham in a head-to-head contest against the sitting Prime Minister. 47% name him as their first choice for leader. Starmer, leading a government with a parliamentary majority that should theoretically insulate him from this kind of internal turbulence, trails his own potential challenger by more than 20 percentage points among the very people who determine Labour's future. These are not protest numbers, these are structural numbers, and they reflect something deeper than dissatisfaction with a difficult political period. They suggest a portion of the Labour movement has made a considered judgment about direction, not just performance. Yet the Burnham calculation is more complex than the headlines suggest. His own supporters, including Leeds MP Alex Sobel, are managing expectations carefully, signalling that an immediate leadership challenge is not the plan, that Burnham would seek to enter Parliament, potentially serve in government, and work to reshape the political direction from the inside. This is a sophisticated approach, and it reveals something important. Burnham understands that charging at a sitting Prime Minister with an 81 MP threshold for a formal challenge when the parliamentary arithmetic remains uncertain is a different proposition than winning a member ballot. The numbers among members favour him, the numbers among MPs are a separate and much harder equation. Starmer knows this too, and that knowledge informs the steadiness of his public positioning. He refuses to set a timetable for departure. He does not engage with the leadership speculation on Burnham's terms. He governs, visibly and deliberately, as though the question of his continuation has already been answered, because in his judgment it has been. There is a strategic logic to this posture that his opponents find infuriating precisely because it is effective. every day that Starmer remains in Downing Street, conducting cabinet meetings, receiving foreign leaders, managing the legislative programme and delivering policy announcements, is a day that the alternative Labour narrative struggles to coalesce into something concrete enough to be actionable. Burnham's policy positioning adds another layer of complexity. His call for greater devolution, his critique of what he terms a bloated national state and a malnourished local one, carries genuine intellectual substance and speaks to a real tension in how Britain is governed. Power concentrated in Westminster, distributed unevenly across regions that experience wildly different economic realities, is a structural argument with deep roots in British political thought, and Burnham's record in Greater Manchester gives him credibility on that argument that most Westminster politicians simply cannot match. But his recalibration on Europe is notable. Having previously expressed personal support for the UK eventually rejoining the EU, he explicitly steps back from that position now, warning against rerunning the arguments of the Brexit years, stating clearly he is not proposing UK membership. This is not ideological surrender, it is political reading. He understands that the electorate that Labour needs to hold, particularly in the post-industrial constituencies that swung toward Brexit and then returned to Labour in 2024, cannot be approached with a pro-rejoin message without serious electoral cost. The recalibration reveals a politician thinking about the general election, not just the leadership ballot. And that matters, because the argument between Burnham and Starmer, should it fully materialise, will not ultimately be decided by polling among current Labour members. It will be decided by who can credibly claim the path to a second term in government.
Streeting's position in all of this is revealing in its own way. 4% of Labour members rank him as their first choice for leader. 57% believe he was wrong to resign. The political judgment embedded in those numbers is significant. Even among those who are dissatisfied with Starmer's leadership, the majority do not regard a high-profile resignation accompanied by a resignation call as a legitimate or admirable move. There is, within the Labour coalition, a residual instinct for loyalty to the governing project that figures like Streeting may have miscalculated in their public positioning. The new cabinet taking shape around Starmer is therefore not just an administrative exercise, it is a political statement. The people he appoints to replace those who have departed carry a message about the direction he intends to pursue, the priorities he will anchor his government to, and the kind of Labour project he believes Britain elected in 2024. The health brief in particular carries enormous symbolic weight given the circumstances of Streeting's departure, and the appointment to that role will be read by party, by press, by public as a declaration of intent. Whether Starmer uses this moment to recalibrate policy emphasis, to signal openness to some of the criticisms that have built up around him, or to hold his existing course with a refreshed team, is the question that the coming days will answer. What is clear is that the political environment Starmer is navigating carries a degree of internal pressure that few modern prime ministers have faced at this stage of a mandate, with a majority of this size in a government this recently elected. The conventional logic of British politics says that landslide victories buy time, buy loyalty, buy the latitude to govern without looking over your shoulder. That logic is being stress-tested in real time, and the result of that test will shape not just the remainder of this Parliament, but the architecture of British centre-left politics for the decade ahead. The question is not simply whether Starmer survives, it is what kind of Prime Minister he becomes in the act of surviving, and whether that version of leadership carries enough weight to meet the scale of what Britain actually requires from its government right now.